Well, hello everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you on this grey afternoon where I am. This short paper, as George has already said, pairs with the following one from Dr. Christina Tsoraki. It arises from the work that we've done together and with all the other wonderful names that you can see on my slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our work on the Upton Lovell G2A assemblage, which was published in Antiquity just before Christmas last year. This work then provided their foundation for a small project funded by the British Academy that Christina is going to present some really early but lovely preliminary results from. So, around about 4,000 years ago, two bodies were sequentially laid to rest under the Upton Lovell G2A burial mound in southern Britain. Upton Lovell G2A is a low, 10-metre wide circular mound that was excavated in 1801 by William Cunnington. The probable primary inhumation was found at the base of a grave cut into the chalk, lying on their back about a metre below the mound's surface. A second individual was found above the first and is described in the literature as being in a sitting position, which Stuart Pigott infers to really mean that they were a crouched inhumation. The primary burial is usually described as male, and the secondary burial is usually described as female, but there is no osteological assessment that has been published of these remains. The burial is famous for its extensive assemblage of grave goods. No plan of the grave exists, but there are descriptions of where some of the grave goods were found in relation to the two bodies. Associated with the primary burial were over 40 perforated bone points. Of these, most were found close to the feet of the primary burial, and another 12 near to the chest. Other finds by the feet included 9 stone rubbers. Those are kind of worked stone cobbles, a stone grooved abrader, a copper alloy awl, 2 halves of a broken battle axe, 4 polished flint axes, 3 of which were complete. Further up the body and close to the legs were 3 perforated boar's tusks and 4 flint nodule cups. And then by the chest of the primary burial was a complete battle axe. The grave goods also included some jet beads, a bone bead, and a jet belt ring, but there's no clear association between a particular body or a particular place for those objects. There are currently no published radiocarbon dates associated with the burial, but if we look at the grave goods, particularly the battle axes, the awl, and the bone points, then the likely date for this grave is somewhere between 1850 and 1700 BC. The numerous grave goods associated with the burials have attracted multiple interpretations. From the outset, the literature emphasises the primary so-called male burial as the one that invites interpretation, and the second body in the grave receives very little attention. Pigott argued that the perforated bone points and the boar's tusks were a costume. He compared the burials to ones from the Mesolithic in Europe and Russia, where individuals interred with these kinds of costumes are usually interpreted as shamans. He also argued that the individual was of high status because they'd been buried with the complete battle axe. As a result, the burial is often referred to as the Upton Lovell shaman burial. In the 1970s, Pigott later compared the stone polishing tools found in the grave to metalworking tools from continental Europe and argued that the individual might have also been a metal worker, so a shaman, a high status person, a metal worker. Then in the year 2000, Colin Shell highlighted a much earlier piece of work from 1870 by the antiquarian Thurnham. Thurnham had identified some gold traces on one stone tool, and Colin Shell went and employed non-destructive semi-quantitative XRF analysis to the gold traces, showing that the elemental makeup of the material was indeed similar to that known for other examples of early Bronze Age gold. So he concludes that the individual may be a shaman, a metal worker, a Wessex gold worker, or perhaps all 3. Our research focuses less on who the individuals buried at the site were and more on what they did by studying the grave goods that have been made and used. We used microwear analysis to study the stone and metal objects from the grave, expanding on earlier work by combining low and high power microscopy of all the stone and flint objects, as well as the copper alloy ore. In particular, our kind of wear analysis thinks a lot about contact materials and the kinetics and movements involved in these processes. This allowed us to identify areas of the surface on the tools for non-destructive compositional analysis using SEM-EDS. Comparison of the results to gold alloy compositions of early Bronze Age metalwork demonstrates that the metal traces identified on the surface of a whole range of different stone tools from this grave are consistent with early Bronze Age gold. We've therefore argued that the grave goods are a gold working toolkit, expanding the kinds of objects that we might think belong in a gold working toolkit, and being able from that to begin to piece together the chaîne operatoire for gold working at this point in the early Bronze Age. So what then has our analysis revealed? Given the time limits, I've just decided to pick out a few of the many stories that emerged from the analysis. I've gone with some of the bits that if you've read the paper, you'd have had to have read the SI really carefully to have necessarily brought these things out, in the hope that if you're already bored because you read the paper, I might tell you something that perhaps you hadn't quite realised. So within the assemblage, there's a group of stone tools that have previously been described collectively as stone rubbers or polishers. These tools show variation in their size, morphology, and surface treatment. And they range from kind of naturally water-worn surfaces to really intentionally polished ones. And therefore, the tools can be associated with different processes and actions in the gold working process. Based on the microwear and residue analysis found on the surface of the objects that are consistent with early Bronze Age gold alloys, the kind of tools that you've seen in the last two slides are basically being used for the plastic shaping and planishing of metals using hammering actions, either as handheld hammers or as lower stationary anvils. Within that grave assemblage, there are two parts of a repurposed battle axe. So one of those is the battle axe, this little chunk that you can see on the right-hand side of your screen right now. That's part of a battle axe made from Cornish greenstone that's been reworked into a metalworking tool. And the gold traces that were found on this repurposed battle axe fragment is compositionally really similar to the gold traces that we've got from this round flat stone. We effectively think they're a hammer and anvil, and we can show that they've been used together because the traces are compositionally so tight between the two of them. So we can see a literal toolkit of different coloured stones being brought together in the gold working process. Apart from the two heavily reworked battle axes, the burial also contains another two battle axes, a complete one that you can see on the left here, and one that's broken into two pieces that you can see in the middle. At some point in their history, both the complete and the battle axe fragments have all been reused as handheld hammers for gold working, but to quite different extents. There's kind of different amounts of wear across these three different objects that are all at different stages in their history, from complete to almost unrecognizable for the ones on the right-hand side. In the case of the complete battle axe, different gold traces of distinct compositions were found on its surface, suggesting that the battle axe was used for working different gold alloys and had experienced multiple phases of use. There's also evidence for its kind of prior use as a battle axe in the breaking and processing of bone from that one's surface as well. So you can see here, we know that the particular alloys that we've got are early Bronze Age, but the slight differences in them indicate that this is gold that's probably coming from slightly different. Chris Standish, who's done this work, prefers the term gold pool rather than source, because source is a bit more complicated and suggests a really precise origin in a way that we still don't have for early Bronze Age gold. So some of the traces on the battle axe are also consistent with the composition of traces found on a polishing tool, which allows us to begin to suggest that some of the gold is literally moving between these different tools in a really clear way. The microwear traces on a slate polishing tool that we've got are consistent with the use of the object in an abrasive motion for polishing and finishing. And we also found copper traces on this object as well, suggesting that it's a multifunctional tool used with different metals, not only for the working of gold. Traces of copper alloys were also found on other stone objects in the assemblage, including the stone that's been used as an anvil and an object that's referred to as a grooved abrader. So what kind of gold work were these tools used on? We think that they're best understood in relation to the sheet gold cover tradition, where intricate incised designs are applied to sheet gold that's usually then wrapped around a core of another object, such as jet, shale, amber, wood, or copper. So the one you've got here on the screen is a jet core with a gold cover that goes on the top and around the edge of it effectively. As a result of this, we decided that we'd like to think a little bit more about, if you like, the other half of the question here. We've looked at the stone tools that have been used in the metalworking. What could we learn and potentially improve our chaîne opératoire by looking at the gold objects as well? So we applied to the British Academy for a small grant with the permission from Wiltshire Museum to study some of the gold sheet cover objects from their collection. And we were lucky enough to have a wonderful host of these objects with us in Leicester for about 6 weeks earlier this year. The analysis was carried out in spring, and in the minute we're in the process of writing up what we've got and thinking through the results. The work included both kind of compositional work with a whole range of different techniques, exploring how you get a slightly different answer if you use PXRF, microXRF, and SEM EDS, for example. And then also combining that with wear analysis. So Christina's going to present you with a little snapshot from these in the next paper. This work is also part of the impetus for a new project that we've just started at Leicester that Christina's working on alongside Matt Hitchcock and David Such, who are both in the audience today. This project will be studying both metal objects and also the stone tools that this kind of past work reveals are so important in the process of metalworking, using that same combination in our work of combining wear analysis and compositional analysis. So hopefully in the next few years, we'll have some more exciting things to tell you about lots of lovely bronze, both from the Bronze Age and into the early Iron Age as well. So
fantastic. Thank you very much. And Christina, do you have the second half? Amazing.
Yes. So I'm just trying to share my screen.
There we are.
Can you see it?
Can see it. It's not full screen yet, though.
Let me just. Sorry.
No worries.
Okay.
You just do the from beginning button. That should sort you out.
Okay. Yeah, is that okay now?
There you go. Brilliant.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so following from, as Rachel said, following the identification of the gold working toolkit from the Upton Lovelty to a burial, we decided to extend our selection of material and to start studying gold objects in order to understand gold working practices in more detail. So we selected a number of gold objects, in total 25 in total, that were found in a series of richly furnished early Bronze Age graves in Wessex. And we analyzed material from 4 different graves, that is Mears G6A, Preshut G1. Okay, sorry, I had some issue with my. Okay, the Upton Lovell G2E burial and the famous objects from the Bush Barrow burial in Wiltshire. We analyzed the selected objects using different non-destructive analytical techniques, mainly microwear analysis using a stereo microscope and a reflected light or metallographic microscope with magnifications up to 500 times, a profilometer, and we conducted compositional analysis, as Rachel mentioned, using different techniques such as SEM EDS, portable XRF, and micro XRF. And we also applied RTI and photogrammetry. We are still processing, obviously, the data we managed to get out of all these different techniques. So we're at an early stage of this analysis yet. So today I would like to just present a few results from the microwear analysis. And I would like to discuss a small number of objects and present some of the initial results we have in relation to their manufacture, use, and subsequent handling. But I would also like to talk a little bit about the possible tools that may have been used during the production of these objects. The objects I would like to discuss today all come from the burial, the Upton Lovell G2E burial. The burial is also known as the Golden Barrow. It contains a lot of gold objects, and I will be focusing on a few sets of this material. Among the gold objects that were found in the burial are a series of gold cylindrical beads that are about 6 millimeters in diameter, and you can see them here. They are 11 in total. The beads are made from rolled up gold seed and have two open ends, each covered by a cup end. The ends were decorated with a series of dots and grooves, and two perforations are visible on the side of the beads, as you can see here. The beads show great consistency in their execution, though not all beads are as neatly manufactured. The embossed dots, grooves, and perforations were created on the gold seed before each of the beads were assembled. The craftsperson used guidelines to indicate the exact piece of gold they needed in order to make the individual beads, and you can see evidence of this guideline on this picture here. In some cases, the craftsperson, as the craftsperson was cutting the gold seed, they accidentally went over the area where the dots were located and inadvertently removed some of them. And you can see these traces here. As you can see, some of the dots are not really very visible anymore because they were cut during the original removal of the piece from the original gold seed. A punch with a rounded tip that was held at different angles was used to emboss the dots, which are not always well spaced, and you can see some examples here on this slide. The perforations were formed after the dots and the grooves were created, and one of the beads actually shows traces of this indentation that you can see here on the lower photo. And what we understood is that they actually were first creating this hollow on the dorsal side of the gold seed in order to indicate where the perforations would be subsequently placed. And then the perforation was punched from the ventral surface of the seed. The perforation openings on the outer and inner layer of the rolled up beads are not always aligned, while in some cases the perforations are not always completely punched through. In terms of user-related traces, most of the perforations do not have any deformation on their rims, and only rarely a facet or limited rounding is present on the perforation rim. The lack of developed wear traces on the perforation rims may suggest that attachment may have involved wrapping fine thread around the grooves at the cup ends rather than using the perforations to suspend the beads. Overall, the manufacture of the beads follows an almost identical production process, and this is also mirrored by the results of the compositional analysis, which showed that all 11 beads have the same elemental composition, suggesting that this group of beads were made from the same piece of gold, and we may be seeing here the outcome of a single production event. Now, the second object I would like to consider is an object that covers a solid conical core object that is made of shale, and it consists of two separate pieces, the conical body and the base. The lower part of the conical body is decorated with a series of grooves and zigzag lines, while the base is more densely decorated with an outer groove forming a circle and a series of chevrons that form 4 quadrants. Overall, the manufacturing process entailed a sequence of hammering, polishing, and engraving actions, followed by an additional stage of final polishing. The grooves are U-shaped and seem to have been executed at a slight angle. Variations in the shape, length, and depth of the grooves suggest that these were not made mechanically using some sort of a device, such as a comb, for instance, but instead the grooves were created as individual elements through repeated abrasion. The ends of the grooves, as you can see in the photos, do not always align very well with adjacent grooves. And finally, the circular groove was hand-drawn, and it was created in a single action rather than drawn in segments. And that's a technique we've actually seen on the object from the sand disk, from the Mir sand disk, which is dated in the Beaker period, so it's a little bit earlier. So they're using a different techniques in that phase in relation to this later early Bronze Age material. Possible manufacturing errors are visible in the area of the chevrons, where we noted the presence of finer lines that seem to respect broadly the location of the subsequent grooves that form the chevrons. So here in this image, you can see this line, and here is with a metallographic microscope, and this is the actual groove of the chevron. And this possibly are some possible manufacturing errors. Now, at the base of the object, there are two areas that look almost square in view and have a rugged appearance. These have been interpreted as possible perforations, but their appearance is not consistent with other perforations we encounter on gold objects. These rugged areas potentially relate to an attempt to cut a squared piece off the base of the conical button rather than create actual perforations. During the microwear analysis, though, we found further perforations or unfinished or attempts to create perforations, both on the base and the conical body of the object. These perforations have a rounded shape, and their morphology is consistent with the morphology of the tip of copper alloy ores that were found in the Golden Barrow burial context and the Upton Lovell G2A burial that Rachel presented in the previous presentation. All perforations relate to the later stage of modification of the gold surfaces as they cut through existing features, such as decorative grooves, and were not part of the original design. Based on their location on the surface of the object, a possible function for suspension is not always very convincing. Moreover, there are areas on the base of the conical object that show intense abrasion, suggesting that during use, this part of the object was in contact with another surface against which it was rubbing quite heavily. And that's why we have the formation of these heavily abraded areas that you can see in these images. A series of curious perforations were also identified on another set of objects that were found in the Upton Lovell G2E burial. These gold objects, which are almost identical in their form and associated wear traces, have two parts, an upper conical part and a cylindrical body. They were originally assumed to be part of a single object. It is not clear how they were meant to function. Cunnington had suggested that they belonged to a wooden scepter, while later they were interpreted as actually being forming some sort of a container, a box, and that's how they have been reconstructed in their current form. So unfinished perforations to form circular form or hollows were found on the edge of the conical part of both boxes, actually in exactly the same locations, but similar to the conical button, the role of these perforations is not immediately apparent. The objects also offer some interesting insight in the manufacturing techniques that were used in order to shape them. In contrast to other gold objects from this burial, where repeated abrasion was used in order to create grooves, as you can see, for instance, this image here on the bottom right corner. Shallow grooves on the body of these gold boxes were formed using chasing, which leaves a very regular topography in the interior surface of the groove, as you can see on these upper two images. More interestingly, analysis of the object surfaces under high magnification, 100 times magnification with the reflected light microscope, showed that the rough surface in the groove interior is overlain by a micropolis that develops on topographic elevations and has transverse directionality. This suggests that an abrasive but relatively soft material was tied around the body of the object, and the gold surface was not always visible during its use. Now, as I hope it becomes apparent from this brief presentation, different techniques were used to make gold objects in the early Bronze Age, and variations in the way some of these techniques and elements were executed. For instance, grooves were created using different techniques, either chasing or repeated abrasion. This variation potentially may suggest that the gold objects that were found actually in the Upton Level G2E burial were the work of different craftspeople. I mean, this is just an initial observation, but it's something that we would need to consider, whether people are using different ways to create different manufacturing elements, or potentially, of course, it could be the same person just choosing to use a different technique. But it's just some of the possibilities we need to be exploring. Following the production of the gold objects, people continue to engage with them in different ways. Our analysis suggests that the creation of perforations or hollows on the gold surfaces using copper alloy awls and disrupting existing decorative elements was rather a common practice. Finally, while contemporary perceptions of value place emphasis on gold as a valuable material, evidence about the wrapping of gold objects with other materials suggests that at least at times, the gold materials themselves may have been obscured from view, and another material, perhaps of perishable nature, took center stage at the performances the gold objects were part of. Thank you so much for your attention.